Welcome, welcome, welcome. I cannot be any more ecstatic than to build a course on clean code, maybe testing. I like me some testing, but clean code is really a passion of mine. It's something that's going to really level your career up and level your skill set up in a relatively short amount of time once you understand some of the concepts behind it. So on these courses, I like to use the sort of gathering title or the grouping title, Code Like a Pro, because that's really what I'm trying to get you to do. I'm trying to get you to go from aspiring engineer to a professional engineer and what that actually means. And here I will be your host, teacher, whatever you want to call it, sensei, mentor, general. Hence, I'm using my little funny portrait here I had painted of me, royalportraits.com, if you want to have some fun, to really show that I know what I'm talking about here. But my name is Dylan Israel. I'm a senior software engineer. I currently work at Amazon, and we're going to be doing some cool stuff, man. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're going to be talking about variables, functions, classes, comments, not anything that's super intense. Not anything that's super out of the norm. I'm not going to hit you with recursion. I'm not going to hit you with triple node binary trees or graphs no, we're talking about how we can fundamentally write cleaner code to make our life easier. What does that mean? What are our objectives? Well, we're going to write code that's going to be more searchable, readable, and understandable. That's it. Very simple. And by that, you're going to be able to write professional level code. You see what I did there? Kind of fun, right? So who's this course for? Well, it's for aspiring software engineers. If you're just learning code today, if you just stick in here a little bit, you'll come out a better developer. In this short course, you'll learn quite a bit. It's definitely for junior engineers. That's when I spent my time looking into the clean code that my tech lead recommends. Senior engineers. This surprises me quite a bit how many senior level software engineers are senior just in years of experience and not in actual skill. It's very common, at least in our field and in my experience, for people to have 10 years experience, but they repeated that first year 10 times. I don't want you to do that. And it's going to be for people who are interested in quality assurance. QA writes code too in their own way, and this can help them quite a bit. And then, of course, those just looking to better understand JavaScript, because that's what we're going to do. And you're going to pick up a few of the things in the language that we can do to make our code more readable, searchable, and understandable. So why do we do this at the end of the day? Well, 90% of your job is reading code, believe it or not. Even if it's greenfield development, you're reading code, you're writing code, obviously, but you need to be able to understand what it is that you did 2 months from now, 3 months from now. And it becomes very hard very quickly. There's an old joke when it comes to coding that when I wrote this, only I and God understood what it did and how it worked. 3 months later, now only God understands. And we're trying to eliminate that issue. It's a natural progression of your skill set. We want you to become better engineers. You should hope to, in whatever profession that you are part of, to become more skilled at it. Employers value this skill. I can tell you that for me, there's 3 things that allowed me to double my income early on in my career: testing and clean code and the solid principles. So it's a skill that employers value. As you're going from smaller to mid to large size companies, people are going to really value you being able to write clean code. And from a very practical standpoint, the payoff of the effort to learn to implement clean code, which makes your life easier and is valued as a skill, you get 10 times easy the payoff for the amount of effort it takes to learn, because it's some very fundamental stuff. So I'm very excited about this course. And I'm not just saying that because they're paying me. I really am. This is something I'm very passionate about. And if you've ever watched my YouTube channel or anything like that, I'm over here harping on this, and I harped on it at every organization I've ever worked at. But clean code is a must-have skill and something that's going to really make you a better software engineer. So with all that being said, hyping it up, let's go ahead and jump into it and see what we're talking about here. Germa takes a very challenged approach to their courses. And for the most part, that works for a lot of things. It's going to be a little harder here with linters. So we're going to do a little bit more slides, but we're going to have a nice challenge at the end, should you choose to accept it. And I hope you do. So what is a linter? what it basically does is it's some conventions in your code to make sure that you're standardizing it and to make your code more readable a lot of times and just better. It could be simple things like missing white space where you can see that yellow squiggly there, and you hover over, go and tell you what you need to do to fix it, right? What the issues are. It could be other things like disallowing console logs and even breaking it out between, oh yeah, you're allowed a console log and a console table, but maybe not a console info. It's very powerful. It can do quite a few things. It can even enforce standards in your code, such as public variables, go after private or vice versa, and so on and so forth. No empty constructors in your classes, a lot of things. And they're usually very customizable. And on top of that, there's a lot of already predefined ones that you can just import. You don't have to go and figure this all out on yourself. I like to go in sometimes and tweak it to make it more strict. I think strict is good. Now, one thing I would tell you to make your life a little bit easier, depending on which IDE you're going to use, there's usually going to be a setting you can turn on that it auto lints for you as you go, if it can. It may not always be able to, because the actual linting may in fact be more of a warning, hey, this might change your logic. But if it doesn't change the logic, you can go ahead and in VS Code at least have it format on save, as well as have it fix the linting errors it can on save, and just let it automate that process, make your life a little bit easier. Now, I do have a bonus challenge here for you. I'm not going to go on this journey with you, but I'm going to go on the rest of it with you. So don't worry about that. But what I'd like you to do is go ahead and add ESLint to one of your GitHub projects that you have out there. Something where you're like, hey, I don't have a linter on here. I want to see maybe what it will tell me, how I can improve. I've included the link here to the Getting Started guide on eslint.org. And just keep in mind, depending on the IDE or text that you're using, you may have to add an extension. But the guide should walk you through all that. Good luck. I hope you do it, and I hope you do it in all your future projects. Let's go ahead and move on with the course. All right. Welcome to the clean code, or as I like to call it, its spicier title, Code Like a Pro, the variables introduction. I am Dylan Israel, as you already know. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about how we can write cleaner code, specifically with variables. We're going to have three main objectives when we do this. We want to have more searchable, readable, and understandable code. A lot of ables there, but by the end of it, you'll be able to write cleaner code. This is important. How are we going to do that, right? These are just words, right? We have three main objectives, but how do we accomplish them? Well, we're going to accomplish them by following some language standards, making sure that we're doing what the average, in this case, JavaScript developer would do. Now, a lot of these items you're going to be able to transfer between languages. That's what's so great about standards and clean code and practices and design principles, things like that, is it's language agnostic, although of course we're going to be doing it in JavaScript. We're going to show the benefit of limited scope. We're also going to talk about creating new variables versus reusing, when and why to do that, the importance of eliminating magic numbers, how choosing a name to describe what it does, but not how it does it, is very important. And we're also going to do what I call the parent or significant other test. And all I mean by that is if a variable name doesn't make sense to my mother, who's not very tech savvy, love her to death, but that's the truth, then it's not a descriptive enough variable name, and we can do better. We're also going to talk about when to use long names and short names and a lot more. So this is probably the part of the course, which is why we're starting with it, that can have the most impact immediately. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So let's start with a basic example of just adhering to some of the language standards that you would expect in JavaScript. Typically, when you have a variable like count here, if it's in all uppercase, we're expecting this to be a constant. Typically, it's just going to be an imported constant at that. But here, it's not following camel case. Now, some of your linters may catch this, but it's important to know what your standards are in your language of choice and to follow them. The reason is it's more readable. Pretty straightforward. Now, as we're looking at this, we don't actually ever go and reassign the value. Again, your linter may catch this, but this would typically be a const. But is it even actually fully correct? Do we actually even do anything with it? No, not really. We could probably just eliminate this and change some of our logic. And then by doing that, maybe we can actually go and see if there's a better name that we can go and update items with. Now, let's see. Instead of count being equal to 0 here, and again, this method, it's not really important what the method does. We're trying to adhere to standards, right? Who really cares what it does? So is I less than num, and we've eliminated that. But then you see here on line 7 with our variables that we're sort of modifying our original input. Usually not the best standard. So what would be actually a good name here? Well, what about total multiplications? And we simply start it by initializing it equal to the number. That's what we're doing here. We're trying to get the factorial total. And we go ahead and change this number to total multiplications. But don't always settle on your first name. Think about it for a second. Your variable names are going to be something that is going to be the most descriptive item in your application. It's oftentimes going to replace comments, which you'll see later on in this course. So maybe factorial total would be the best name. And now, by having our factorial total, we know exactly what the objective here for factorial total is, and we have created something that follows the JavaScript standard, but really the variable naming convention standard, something that's a little bit more descriptive. So let's move on to descriptivenames.js. And I want to give you an example, a very basic one, of the significant other test, as I call it. Now, before my girlfriend left me, I would have had her chime in on this and it would have been very funny. So I will do my best acting. Hey, baby, what do you think a variable D stands for? Don't be gross, Dylan. I was like, all right, well, what do you think a variable today's date stands for? Well, clearly it stands for today's date. Now, in this case, it's kind of silly, right? Because it's such a small function, but you get the idea. We've now eliminated something that may be lost in context. Now, we'll talk more about short distance variable naming and long distance variable naming later on. But let's look at a more realistic example now. All right, so we're at our first challenge here for our variables for clean code. Now, a couple things to note. You can see down below we have a function called getUsersFullName, and that takes in an array of strings with a first name followed by middle name and last name. And what we want to return from this function is the first name, the middle initial, and then the last name. That's what this does. How might we go and make this more readable? Now, that's all I'm going to say. I want you to see if you can figure out a couple things on your own and how to make it more readable. But if you need some direction, there's a hints.md file here. I'm not going to click it because I want you to make that distinction yourself. That might give you some direction. But think about it, what we've done, and there's going to be some ways that we can make it more readable that we're not going to expressly talk about. And I want to see if you can come up with it. But if not, don't worry. We're going to do it in just a second. Were you able to do it? If not, no worries. Let's talk about some of the items that we can use here. Some of our best tools are simply to do things like array deconstruction. Now, you may have started by going and creating a first name is equal to usernames 0. And let's go ahead and actually do that. And then maybe we did a middle initial equal to this right here. Then we did a last name. This would have been great, and it is great, I should say, because you would have practiced something that we talked about of putting our descriptive variables, and then we paste them in here, obviously. This is definitely a much better solution than was there before. We know exactly what this is based off of the array values. Instead of just sort of throwing it in there, we can now see like, oh, cool, this is actually the first name and the middle initial and the last name being passed along. It's kind of hard to follow some of it, though, with this spacing. So we use some of the ES6 string interpolations with backticks here to actually paste it together so it looks a little bit more readable. We know exactly what's going on, and we don't have to jump these plus signs together and do all that craziness that you typically had to do in the past. And get rid of that. We made it just a little bit more readable using string interpolation and then some descriptive variable names. Now, at this point, this would be fine, but my personal preference would actually to be use some array deconstruction. And here we can do it like so, where on the, let's get rid of this 0. Let's take that first value out of usernames, called first name, and then we'll have a middle name here. And then we'll have a last name, because that's the order that's going: 0 index, 1 index, 2 index. And then we can just go and create our middle initial from our middle name. Set it equal to middle name, the first character. With that, we have a couple more lines of code. That's fine. What we're really going for here is readability. And this is much more readable than what we started with. Still get my full name down below. I'm going to call this challenge 1.5 because it's not really something we expressly went over, but we kind of did talking about variables. But how might we look at our very basic cat class here and say to ourselves, does any of this look redundant? And see what we might change. Go ahead and give it a shot. Now, there's not a lot of code here, so maybe it's fairly obvious, but one common thing you'll see again and again, let's say we have my little cat Tito, right? And we'll say Tito is equal to our new cat class. Again and again, I'll see properties that have this prefix of the cat name, and it's definitely a bad pattern to start. It's redundant. So in our case, Tito.catAge, say he's 12. And then we have Tito.catName. And we'll say Tito is now decided to upgrade to a Milo. This is essentially saying cat.cat, right? We don't need that. So a better way of changing this is to drop that prefix. Oops. There we go. And same thing here. Age. And now it makes a little bit more sense for the Tito.age and Tito.name, which is really cat.age and cat.name. So think of that when you are using your class properties, your objects, you're following the interface segregation principle, which is part of the solid principle. It's not something we're going to get into this course about, but I like mentioning these sort of mid-tier, higher tier things so that eventually on your coding journey, you've at least heard of it. And maybe you'll say, I remember that one crazy guy mentioned this thing. Maybe I should look into it. That's what I'm going for here. Magic numbers are something that will perplex you if you've ever had to work in a legacy application or even your own code a couple months back. There's an old saying in programming that goes, when I wrote this code, only me and God knows what it did. A month later, now only God knows. So that's an old saying. So we want to make it more readable and eliminate some of these magic numbers. Not really important what the code does. It's calculating an orbital period with an array of values. But what is this number? Do you know what 6367447 is? Or do you know what this 3984418 is? I honestly don't. I had to go back and rewatch a video where I did this. But you know what I could do to make this so much easier? So I could go and create this variable called earth radius and set it equal to this. Now I'm eliminating magic number 1. That makes more sense where I'm going and getting the earth radius. And what I also could do to figure out what this is here is I could go and I could store that in a variable called the gravity metric and store that like so. And bam. Now, when we go and we have our gravity metric, we know exactly what those numbers represent. There are no more of these magic numbers that are there, here or there, and all this other stuff. And we could even clear up A, B, and C to see what that is, to make it a little bit more a little bit more descriptive, but that's not what this is about. This is about these magic numbers that we can then go and provide context for what Earth radius is and what gravity metric is. And we'll actually circle back to a similar example of this, of some items that we can do to improve this further. But for now, we'll stop right here. I wanted to kind of make a point here about how hard it is sometimes to go back and retroactively do these things. I wrapped this up and the editor was like, hey, why don't you go and fill in A, B, and C here just so that we complete it? And it makes a lot of sense, right? And I really struggled because they weren't descriptive variable names. Do I know what A is? I can probably figure this out, but really the intent here is to have 2 pi. So, okay, cool. We can figure this one out. As I go in here and replace A there, do I really remember when I solved this what C is representative of this equation? The math pow plus the object's average alteration? No, not really, to be honest. I mean, we can make something up here just to give an example. So let's say this is like the we're making stuff up for sure. Gravity circumference. Gravity circ reference. Sorry, I'm a bad speller. And we'll put that as our C. Then B, I can't really tell you, but maybe we'll just say the total gravimetric, right? You can definitely see how something in this where it's hard to go back and put yourself right back in that context without a lot of additional work and really start understanding, especially something so math heavy. But keep that in mind as you're going through here that when you're working in the code, that is the time to think about it because you're in it and it's all clicking. And you know exactly what you're doing and when you're doing it. So with that being said, guys, let's go on to the next screencast. All right, we're at our second variables challenge here, and this one's specifically testing magic numbers. Now, it's kind of a two-part challenge. One, I want you to come up with a better name. Two, I want you to figure out if you can kind of see what time 86,400,000 is representing. And if you can't, that's okay, because this is the exact point of why magic numbers can cause a lot of issues. Go ahead, pause the screencast, see if you can do it. Were you able to? I wouldn't have been able to, just for the record. But what this actually is milliseconds in a day. So one thing I wanted to show you is not only, go ahead and rename this to something that makes sense, but also when dealing with items where they're calculation based, instead of putting this number, and I'll go ahead and just put it right above here, a better use case for that is actually to show the multiplication or show the calculation to show how you got there. So how do we get there? Well, there's 60 minutes in a day, 60 seconds in a minute, 24 hours in a day, and then 1,000 milliseconds seconds. I think I said that backwards. So 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, 1,000 milliseconds. And so we get our full multiple there. Not only do we get a context in the variable, we also see how we get to this calculation here, which is a lot more descriptive than simply throwing the 86 million in there. Proper spacing and return statements will make your code a lot easier to read as you go and start working with this stuff. So there's actually a great ESLint rule here that I've attached called padding -line between statements. And it used to be called, used to have a similar one that was like return statements specifically for returns, but this is more general and specific, and that one's been deprecated. But making sure that you have proper spacing is really crucial to making your code more readable. So obviously, in terms of line breaks, if there's a comment here between a function that's not related, you want to have a line break, right? If you have an instantiation here of our variable, you want to break it up from your logic statements. And by that very statement, you also want to have your returns have a new line before your returns. Typically, my personal preference is never to have a return statement or our if statement rather, that's on a different line. You can see how already this is cleared up quite a bit, and it's much more readable. Same thing goes on with breaking this up. In our switch cases, we can have our case with a new break each and every time, like so. And now with proper spacing and returns, we have something that's a little bit more readable as we go through. It's not all jumbled, right? When we think of writing an essay, what do? Well, sentences are all sort of similar, but when we get to a new paragraph, we start breaking it out. We have punctuation, right? It's not just one giant long run-on sentence. And the same goes for your code. Remember, good code should read cleanly and easily and shouldn't be a task. And with proper spacing and return statements, with line before return statements, that's what we're going to have. All right, welcome to the Code Like a Pro, or the Clean Code Functions introduction. A lot of cool stuff. As always, we have our ubbles. Whatever our ubbles when we're writing clean code? Well, we want to make it readable, searchable, and understandable when it comes to functions. So how are we going to do that? Well, by writing small functions that really have a single purpose, making sure that we don't have these massive functions where they're doing a bunch of things. We're going to start also eliminating these Boolean flags a lot of people throw in, where a function does two things, one if it's true, one if it's false. That we can read the function from top to bottom and it all makes sense. That we correctly name our functions. We also limit the parameters. We keep things dry. We avoid side effects when possible, and we make sure not to have globals. So quite a few things here. Let's go ahead and take a look at some examples and practice a bit. All right, so let's start talking about limiting parameters in your functions. You can see here in our, quote unquote bad example where we are getting a user's full name. All it's really doing is taking the first, middle, last, and even the nickname and concatenating it together. Once you get past about 2 parameters, you need to start thinking about, is my function too large, and is it really doing a single thing? And if it's not, how might we go about solving that? Well, in our case here, it is all related, right? This is all our naming information, but 4 parameters is a lot. It gets hard to start juggling these things. So a good implementation of this is to simply you can sort of, I don't want to call it cheating, but it's much easier to have maybe a username that takes in our object that we then can go and do username.first, username.middle, username.last, and then username.nickname. This allows us to pass in a single parameter, only really juggle the 1, and we'll put a 2 on there. There we go. So it doesn't get upset with us. But it allows us to juggle a single parameter, define an interface that we then can pass to and from instead of these strings that who knows what we're going to be using again and again, and makes it a little bit cleaner as we move forward. All right. So if you remember the variable section, we talked a lot about naming variables, and a lot of the same items apply to function names. But we're going to cover 2 main cases of how they differ to make sure that we're doing the naming of functions correctly. So let's talk about that. Now, one of the things you'll see time and time again when naming our functions is the incorrect nature of not using a descriptive enough name. So take a look at this add user and just assume that in the background, we get our data, we do whatever we do with it, and then we add it to the database down below. Here, are we really adding a user, or are we adding a specific type of user? Well, in our case, a more descriptive name to really say what this function's doing is this is adding an admin user. We want to make sure that we make that clear. So you want to describe your functions for what they actually are doing, not just on a low level or a high level, but on a low level. Another common thing when naming your functions is not having a standardization for some of the naming conventions to go with it. Now, every team is going to be different on how they name things, but to standardize stuff is very crucial. So let's take a look at two ways. Here, we're retrieving an admin by ID, and down below, we're getting a user by ID. These are, two different methods. One's specifically for an admin, one's for a user. But the fact that when we retrieve something, that we aren't standardizing it to be get admin by ID when it's get, and you can do the same thing when you're doing a create admin, delete admin, create user, delete user. When you start creating this standardization, it makes your code much more readable. And as you go and you start doing code reviews and PRs and things like that, as you go into more advanced dev flows and dev practices and workflows, as you work, some of these items you'll start to catch in PRs will make your life a little bit easier. So keep that in mind with your descriptive names and your standardization of naming for what a method or a function actually does. All right, welcome to the function naming and standardization challenge. A lot going on there in terms of a challenge name. But what I want you to do is take a look at these 4 function names and see if there's maybe some better naming that we can get behind. Is there anything that we can standardize? Is there something that's maybe a better name? Right, take a look. That's all I'm going to give you. See what you see, and do your best. All right, we're able to do it. Some of our answers here obviously may differ. Clean code is one of those things where it's more about trying to get to the destination than just ignoring the destination. And so what I mean by that is some of our stuff may be a little different, and that's okay. So let's take a look at add message here, right? Fundamentals. We want to do our camel case. We also could probably do a more descriptive name here where this isn't really adding a message, similar to our type here. We have an email, so like maybe even variable renaming email data or just email, and it can still take in a message. And maybe we'll even rename this, right? Add email. Perfect. Depending on how your application runs, you may have add. This could also be create. Typically in my application, when I go and do a post to the database, or I go and I create something new, I'm going to use this as my prefix. Same thing with this empty admin. Anytime I get something, I return, I follow the convention here of get. And we can do empty admin. Not maybe the best descriptive name, but you get the idea. Instead of empty admin, perhaps like new admin, right? And then we have our 2 deletes here, and they have different functions in the sense of what one deletes a user, one deletes an admin, or one removes a user, one removes an admin. So let's just maybe standardize this prefix a little bit here and do delete, or vice versa, change it to remove. Really, it's about taking a look and thinking about, is our function name doing what it says it's doing? And are we following a standard convention so that as I go through the code base, it's a little easier to figure out what it's supposed to be doing. Let's talk a little bit about encapsulating conditionals. If you remember back to our variable section, really what we're trying to communicate there is the power of good naming conventions. And we're trying to do something very similar here. And you probably remember that a lot of times we store them in variables, obviously. Here, it's more about storing pieces of logic into functions, very small ones that we're going to create. And in TypeScript, it's actually really nice. This isn't a TypeScript video, but we can start having these private methods so that we really can go and showcase that, hey, this is never actually supposed to be a public function, or at least used that way. But here in our encapsulating conditionals, what we're really looking at is, hey, this can get very ugly very quickly. My rule of thumb is pretty much anything larger than one conditional or one check in our conditional, I start to throw into some of these smaller methods. And if it's greater than 2, I definitely do it 100% of the time. Now, this is pretty small, but it's all about the demo purposes. So how about we actually make this a little bit more descriptive? Well, one potential way is to go ahead and do the variables that we have talked about. Another is actually to go and create a function. Now, you're going to have to make that distinction based on how much logic there is, how many checks there are. This is kind of small, so either one would work, but really, use your best judgment. Now, what are we checking here? Well, we're checking if a user is active and the user is the primary account holder. And so if that's true, what are we looking for? Well, we'll say create a method, say get is user primary active account, something like that. and it's going to take in a value of user, and really we're expecting a Boolean. And instead, I'll go ahead and copy this over, put this in a return statement, because the intent here, you can see the name is here is even rather long, right? So it's not a short name, it's not a small name. And of course, pass in our user. But now we have a descriptive function in our conditionals. And as this primary active account changes, perhaps we have a date check. We're now housing this in one location and we can sort of break it out. You would even maybe consider doing something like this, where even within here, we start using some of the variable stuff, is primary account, which is probably not what you're going to do in a nested if with two checks, but here we can sort of take it one step further, even start combining some of these items. And another, const is active. And we go ahead and set that equal to this part. Put a nice little line break here for readability. It's actually one fantastic lint setting that you can do for return statements to always have a line in front of them. I highly recommend you turn it on. Here we go. We have a little method that's going to go and be used to describe a different item. And you can kind of see how we can continue to expand upon this, but sort of abstracting it and encapsulating these conditional statements. So really, any of them greater than 2, I'd highly recommend that you do this. Okay, so let's just review real quick what we did here. We created a function, a descriptive function, to break down a piece of our logic in our nested conditionals. Conditionals being the if statement. We even used some of the variable naming that we discussed earlier on in the course to kind of make it even more descriptive. Now, as ES 2020 comes out, you're going to see this more and more as they've added private properties and private methods. And you're going to see more descriptive functions and using in the conditionals, because then you'll of their private access scope. Don't want to dive too much into that, but really just try to understand that the main intent here is to get the non-primary user. It's not to have a whole bunch of logic that has to do with the primary active account. We can break that out into its own private or personal function like this and house it and give it simply a descriptive name. That's really what we're trying to do here. All right, encapsulating conditionals. This is our challenge for that. You can see here we just have this sort of get loading state that passes along some string based on what's happening. It's not really important. What we're looking at here is that we have maybe some if statements that are a little complex, right? They have 3 different inputs, and you may perhaps look at this and say, hey, I could swap in a variable, or depending on the complexity, you might swap in a function to encapsulate it. Either one would do. We're going to practice a little bit here by encapsulating our conditionals in functions. Go ahead and practice writing some functions here that are going to be descriptive enough to encapsulate the logic that's in those if brackets. Were you able to do it? Let's go ahead and give it a shot. So this is saying, hey, if a user exists with the double bang, right, and it is in fact loading and doesn't have an error, go ahead and return finish loading. So how might we write that? Well, we'd have a function, and it could say has user loaded, maybe successfully. That sounds good. Here we'll just take the state object, and then we simply can return what's here. This over. In a more real world scenario, you might have something more complicated than this, but I'd probably store this in a variable, but we can do it here with our function. So has user loaded successfully, go ahead, put that in there. Very descriptive, pass the state. Cool. Now, maybe this one, we'll say user is still loading. Function is user loading. We'll pass the state here, and we'll go ahead and copy. And you know what? This should also be successfully, because that leaves out this last part. We'll return is user loading successfully. And we'll use a method to that function. It's not a method because it's not in the class. Pass the state in here. Now you can see we kind of have 2 methods. One say that it has loaded, and one that it is loading. And it makes it a little bit more descriptive, as well as encapsulate some of this logic, because really what we want to do is get the loading state in these sort of subsections we've broken out. All right, this is one of my favorite sections when it comes to writing code like a pro and writing clean code, because it's also one of the most misunderstood sections. That's comments. And that may seem like a strange thing to you, because a lot of you, when you first start learning to code, you're going to be comment this, comment that. Computer science programs are teaching, aspiring developers to comment everything. And part of that is simply to go and teach you to actually understand your code, but it doesn't stop there, unfortunately, as you go from aspiring software engineer to junior software engineer, which is where it needs to die. And so a lot of this section is going to be talking about how to write good comments and how to eliminate 90% of your comments, which if we followed the previous sections, we already talked about good variable names and good function names. And if we did that, most our comments aren't needed, because what that is, oftentimes in the bad comment category, is a showcase of your code isn't readable enough, thus I have to comment it. Not always the case, but most of the time, 9 times out of 10. So we're going to be talking about what are some bad comments and what are some good comments. So what are some things that makes comments bad, right? Well, as I explained, oftentimes they're unneeded and they're used to explain bad code, right? Another issue is that you have to maintain these things. They're additional level of maintenance. And sometimes it's just leftover code that people are afraid to change, right? Sometimes people put comments about things that version control takes care of and markers in the code, which if you're having to mark your code, oftentimes you need to understand that maybe it's a different file, maybe it's a different intent, and their marker shouldn't be there. It's very, very understood that if I'm having to put something in a file to say, hey, this is different than the rest of the file, then it's a different aspect, and thus we should take it out. And to-dos. I've worked on projects where things change on a daily basis. You can't ever trust to-dos. So those are some of the items that make comments bad. What makes a good comment? Short and concise. These long comments that are very detailed, oftentimes, sometimes they should be good. They're good, but usually it's a sign that your code is over-engineered or there's issues. It provides value. This is really crucial, and we'll showcase a lot of examples that I think some people are going to relate to when they started early on in their career, to see something that doesn't provide any value. And with good variable names and good function names, we can eliminate a lot of comments. Sometimes we have business logic that wouldn't make any sense to anybody, and that oftentimes clarifies why some code is needed when it involves business logic, not how the code runs, but logic as far as the domain specific is needed. And oftentimes a warning for something that is of utmost importance. There's a line in a project I wrote for a $1 billion company that if you remove this certain module that looks sort of strange out of place, the whole app will fall apart because of the intermingling of a Angular web app with a ASP.NET application that was necessary at the time. And then legal comments, things that you absolutely have to put in there. So let's go ahead and look at some examples. I know that's a lot of talking, but this is a very important section, and it came after the variables and the functions and all the other stuff, because if you can do that, we can eliminate a lot of these comments and clean up our code bases quite a bit. What we're looking at here is a function to return all of the longest strings from an array that has strings in it. So if there's the longest one is 10 characters, we're going to return all the 10 character words that's in that string array. I actually wrote this when I was learning to code about 6-7 years ago, which really makes me feel kind of old and how time flies, but that's a separate story. Now, what we're going to do right now is utilize some of the variable names and the function names to eliminate some of these comments and have a more readable code base. So it's going to be some good practice, as well as eliminate some comments that really we don't need. Now let's start from the top and work our way down. if you have to leave a comment for what a function does, oftentimes you have a very poor name or the function is too large. In this case, this is a fairly small function, so I think our name is actually incorrect. And longest string sounds singular. We're not returning the longest string, we're returning longest strings. And because it's a get and we want to standardize our calls, maybe a better name here would be get longest strings. We know it's returning something. We know it's returning the longest of something, and we know it's returning plural here, hence the plural. Now, here, initialize the long string to the first value. We don't really need this initialize, but this variable name here, let length could be anything. Length is a very generic name. What would be a better name? Maybe longest word length, because that's what we're going to use it for down below. We're going to have this placeholder variable that we're going to go and set for anywhere that gets updated. So let's go ahead and make those changes real quick. Now that we have that, we have this other comment. Checks if current string is longer than the current longest. Is this an overly convoluted if statement? To me, this looks like a very singular purpose. It's very straightforward. Is the longest word length less than the current word length? I don't think this needs a comment. This is a perfect example of something that doesn't need a comment, right? This reads very clearly. We set the longest word length. We compare the longest word length in a for loop. This shouldn't be something that needs to be commented. I understand if it's your first programming class, but down the road, not so much. Now, same thing here. Is this filtering? Yeah, filter. Take our array, filter. It's the word.length equal to the longest word length. We don't really need that. Now, where we can make an improvement is STRs. That's sort of generic. What about longest words? So what we've done here is we've eliminated comments that we now have to maintain, that we had to maintain. We eliminated some comments that really didn't really have any other purpose to describe this if statement. It's very straightforward, very simple. And we updated our variable names and our functions names to be more readable. And now we have less code we have to maintain. In my opinion, it's more readable. And we've simply applied the function and variable naming to our better comments, which in this case is actually removing a lot of comments. Let's go ahead and look at some other examples. Let's talk about two more really bad comments that I see from time to time. The first one, not so much, as version control has gotten much better with Git, but version control and log comments, things like this, where you have dates and a comment, and then who it's by, who did what on when. This is what version control is for. We don't need to muddy our code base with comments like this. So if you see something like this, delete it. Delete it, delete it, delete it. So I'm going to leave this here, just so you can see an example here. And then a quick note to removing commented out code. I die a little bit on the inside every time I see a piece of code in my app that's just commented out. Version control keeps track of these things. And oftentimes, what code is doing that is commented out, really the only code you want commented out is one you're actively testing and playing around with, right? This makes a user go and think, why is this commented out? Should I leave it? Probably, because most developers are very scared to leave this in there. I encourage you, and my stance on this, delete it. Just remove commented code. We don't need commented code in our code base. Version control, again, will keep track of that. And it just adds confusion. It's another thing that doesn't need to be maintained. What is this? And things start getting out of sync. So you always want to make sure to remove that commented code and not to leave these silly log messages either. Okay, visual markers. So why are visual markers oftentimes a bad practice? Well, usually what they're doing is they're either providing information that is very apparent and there's no need to provide that information, or it's trying to make sense of something that probably should be in a different file, right? And so oftentimes you'll see them in one of two ways. You'll see them with the dots that have something like this, where by convention, for instance, your dependencies usually go at the top of the file, and most of our linters and things like that will take care of that. So there's really no reason to even have a comment like that. And then you have super unnecessary ones where, take an example of our class here, where you just go properties, right? Properties almost always go first, and our linters will even ensure that. And it's very apparent that that's not really necessary. Now, in a case where you have multiple files like this, you might even see user class, admin class, things like this to show a distinction between the two. This is a good example of where instead of actually having a comment and getting rid of it, go and create a new file, right? Go and do your admin.class.js or something like that. And instead, take this, gut it out in one file, put in another file, of course, get rid of the comment and get rid of this one as well. Because really, at the end of the day, there's a little bit of disagreement on this depending on who you ask. But in my opinion, you want to have a single file per class, and that'll make your life a little bit easier. And that'll also eliminate some of these visual cues that really, at the end of the day, are good indicators of a anti-pattern to showcase that, hey, maybe our file here has multiple purposes, and that is an issue in itself. So when you see those visual cues, think about it, see how you might be able to break it up to make it so that you don't need it, and make your life a little bit easier. One last thing I wanted to add on here, it didn't really need a entire screencast for it, is don't leave to-dos in your code. You might have even before put to-do move into two files, right? Something like that. At the end of the day, priorities change, things change, and just be like Nike and do it. No more to-dos. So keep that in mind. All right, we're on the visual markers challenge, and what I'd like you to do is simply clean up some of these visual marking sort of comments to the best of your ability. I can really tell you how or what to do in terms of the instructions. So it should be pretty clear. It's a very similar example to what we demonstrated earlier. So go ahead, pause the screencast and see if you can solve it. Were you able to? If not, not a huge deal. A lot of this is simply removing things that we don't need, like the dependency visual marker or a marker that says properties, right? Our properties in our classes should by convention go to the top of the class. Also, to do. No to-dos. As far as these pet class and dog class markers, go and create a new file. We'll go ahead and create a new file. We'll call it dog.class.js. And then go ahead and move this over to our dog class, Command V, and then jump back down to our here, and we can eliminate these comments. Eliminate a lot of comments that weren't providing a lot of value, and if anything, were something additional we'd have to keep up to date. And there's a lot of great tools to keep our code organized, and comments aren't a great one. So clean up those visual markers as you go. Let's go ahead and move on. I thought we'd take a quick second just to review what makes a good comment. So we've been going over some bad ones, right? And oftentimes that's half the battle. Knowing what not to do oftentimes leaves you with knowing what to do. If you've done all the mistakes, all you have left are the correct solutions, right? So what makes a good comment? Something that's short and concise. Something that gets to the point. Doesn't really have all this fluff in there that's going to, cause more confusion than anything else. Something that provides value. Does it really give you something at the end of the day, or is it just describing what's going on that you can read in 20 seconds? It oftentimes clarifies code that has a business purpose, but will look sort of out of sort. And oftentimes in that same scope will be a warning or amplification of its importance, and of course legal comments. So let's take a look at the code now that we reviewed that. You can see at the top here, we have one such legal comment. I've had to do these in a couple applications. They're not as common as they were in the past, that pretty much everyone just uses open source library X, Y, and Z. But you can see here, this uses ROS library 1.x.x, and Scrimba assumes all risks in doing so. This comment is mandated by the license, so you use ROS library 2020. This is a legal comment. Sometimes you have to have that in there. It's just the way it is. Now, as far as our date regex goes, do you know what this does? I mean, I'm not the best at regex. I can usually figure it out, but I have no idea what this does. What this actually does, and this is a great example of something that's going to be short and concise, but provide value, is format day, month, year. That's all this does. At the end of the day, is it concatenates, it validates that this whole crazy regex comes in a couple different days, months, and years, like so. That's it. It kind of blows my mind, to be honest. But this is a good example of a comment for when, there's just something that's going to take an extended period of time to really understand. Down below, here's an example of maybe something that looks a little weird. Like, why are we trimming this string before we do it? You might have a comment here. Someone might go, oh, well, that's silly. Maybe we store this in the database correctly. But maybe we have an issue where the UI layer is injecting empty characters. Do not remove trim. Now, another way you can eliminate this comment, and we're not going to talk about testing in here, but a good unit test would actually have this in the unit test to clarify that. Now, you may still remove trim and ignore this comment at some point in time if you think you've solved this, but this is very clear about something that's maybe would catch your eye that you're like not quite sure why that's there. So here's some examples of some good comments. All right, so we just talked a little bit about, what some good comments are. I'd like us to practice a little bit. So our good comments challenge. So why don't you just go ahead and use your imagination a little bit, and come up with an example legal requirement comment. I want you to also add a comment to the regex here that's somewhat unreadable. It's not important what the actual regex does in this case. It's the same one as before, but just add a comment that you think would make sense in this context. And then add a business logic example comment to our function down below. Go ahead, give it a shot. All right, were you able to do it? If not, no worries. Sometimes when you give a little less instruction, people sort of panic a little bit, and that's okay. Here, let's just say for some reason we were using Lodash. I don't think we have to do this for Lodash. And we said, Lodash makes no requirement for its use under MIT license, something like that, 2020. Whatever you wanted to use as your example legal comment. And we have our date regex here. Do format dash, and we'll do month, year, day, whatever it is. It's not important. Probably wouldn't be that. Actually, it'd probably be month, or day. Year. There we go. I don't think the year is ever going in the middle, so let's at least make up our unreadable regex comment to be somewhat realistic. And then down below here, maybe we have, temporary password for stage environment, right? Doesn't really matter. But obviously this would look a little suspect. But here we have 3 comments that sort of provide value. They're good comments. In this case, they're a little silly because it's a challenge, kind of hard thing to write a challenge for, but it's important to practice and start looking at this in your code. And now you have an example of good comments, you have an example of bad comments. And so hopefully you'll use comments sparingly, but this is a nice little challenge to remind you of what's a good one. All right, so we have a final challenge for you, and hopefully you might have seen this coming. The best challenges are ones that you go and challenge yourself, and that's kind of what this is about. Go to your old projects, the ones that you wrote when you're first getting started and haven't looked at for a year, 6 months, maybe 3 months, whatever it is. Go and see if you can apply some of these clean code principles. Go in there and update those old projects. I do it about once every year. I go through some of my old repos, and I don't change the technologies or anything like that, but I do take a look and say, how would I make this better? And I like doing that to see if I improved, and go and take these clean code principles and apply them to all your projects and have some fun with it. Same thing with algorithms. Go in, if you have some algorithms, practice some of these clean code principles on those and review them, and maybe you'll see some stuff of how you can even refactor them as you go. If you are paired up on a team, start implementing these in your code reviews and pair programming sessions. Or if you're just contributing to open source, it's a great way to start practicing this and start looking for it when you do these code reviews and you pair program, so that not only you get better, but you improve those around you as well. Last but not least, go and join the Scrimba Discord channel if you're not already a member, and go and share your before and afters in the I Built This group. A lot of great stuff there. One of the things I like about teaching and mentoring and things like that is helping people improve and helping people learn and motivating people. And you can do that too by just going to the Discord channel and showcasing what it is you're doing. And, people will be able to relate and being like, oh, I'm at the same spot. I'm glad to see someone who's one spot ahead of me succeeding, and so on and so forth. But definitely go and do all these things. This is your final challenge. Quite a bit for you to do. But the thing that you have to remember is, what makes Scrimba so great, or one of the many things that makes Scrimba so great, is that active learning. And this is an extension of that. I want you to be very active. And if you are, you'll retain what's here. You'll write clean code and you'll start coding like a pro. Before we talk about what's next, I just want to say again, congratulations for finishing the course. A lot of people don't make it to the end of the course, and you should feel very proud. And I hope by the end of this course, rather, I know by the end of this course, you have learned at least one thing that you can then go and apply and level up your coding game. That's why I sort of affectionately have called this course Code Like a Pro, because clean code is just one aspect of being a professional software engineer, in my opinion. And I wanted to really make that clear. So what's next, right? Well, if you remember when we started this course, we had three main objectives: making our code more searchable, readable, and understandable. You can make yourself a little bit more able by making things testable and automatable. Sometimes you have to discover these things on your own, but I'm going to give you a place to start. How might we accomplish some of those objectives? Well, we just did some clean code practices. We're going to talk a bit about unit testing in a future course. A little hint, but look forward to an introduction to unit testing course by your boy. Integration testing would be another thing that you could go and look into. We talked a little bit about linters, adding them to your code bases and using them so that you can make things more automated, similar to what we're trying to do with our unit tests and integration tests. Git hooks. Husky is an npm package that will fire off some of these scripts that you have anytime you do a commit or you do a push. That will make it so that it will lint your files if it can, or even spell check our files, which is what the cspell package here I recommend is. I also recommend to make it easier on yourself by configuring your text editor. I use VS Code to autosave, auto format, auto lint, all that sort of stuff. Most our editors are very powerful, and with extensions can do a lot of this stuff for us so that we don't have to think about every minute detail. And of course, look into more advanced items like the solid principles. Some additional resources that I'd highly recommend if you want to dive deeper in clean code. Clean code came about from, not entirely, but from Uncle Bob, Robert Martin. And he has this wonderful book here called Clean Code, a handbook of agile software craftsmanship. And I'd highly recommend that you look into that. The examples there are in Java, but I don't think that's too much of an issue. But I also have this clean code JavaScript repo, which you can click here, which, if I remember correctly, Ryan McDermott, who I think was a Google engineer, took the examples from clean code and created a free NPM repo and did JavaScript examples. So you can check that out if you want to dive deeper in the clean code stuff. Last but not least, I want you to share in the fun on Discord. Scrimba has a fantastic community of all their students and creators like myself that go through there. Lots of great fun over there. You can click this link and join them. But again, guys, thanks so much for taking this course. Thanks so much for being part of the dev community, and congratulations on finishing it. I look forward to seeing some of your successes in the Scrimba Discord channel.